Covered it. What would you need to retake from here? Okay. Thank you.
All right. Mr. Williams is back. I'm confident our jurors are ready. Let's get on the record. We took our afternoon break, which was serendipitously timed with an internet crash where everything died in the courtroom and the courthouse, including our phone system. We're limping along. I think we're back up. Ms. Reimer, are you ready to go for the rest of the day?
Yes, Your Honor.
Excellent. Witnesses ready?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Ms. Wood, anything from the defense?
No.
Let's bring the jurors in, please. Are we done with East Point?
Yes, Your Honor. Yeah. Well, for today. Would you say his name? Little? Dr. Little. Okay. Thank you. Followed by. Or Karen. Got it.
All right, observe. All the girls are present, accounted for.
Thank you, Deputy Gordon. All right, everyone can be seated. I don't know if you noticed, it happened right about the time of the break, but everything shut down. We had an internet crash in the building, which means our phones don't work. And all these devices are connected through Zoom rooms rather than just nice hard wiring. My call. So if the internet goes down, we lose the ability to share evidence on the screens. Fortunately, the squirrels are pedaling faster back in the IT office, and we have Wi-Fi connections now, not Ethernet, which is what we're supposed to have. But I think we'll get through what we need to this afternoon in terms of technology. We'll press on. Worst case scenario, The state can introduce its evidence in the old fashioned way and hold up a picture and you all can look at it that way. It's not the state's fault. This is the county and their technology infrastructure or lack thereof. But we remain in the state's case, and I will ask Ms. Reimer to call her next witness.
State calls Dr. Kevin Little.
Place me and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you will give us will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth of God? Yes. Fill in now, please. And you state and spell your name for the record.
My name is Kevin Little, Kevinlittle.
Good afternoon, Dr. Little. How are you?
I'm well.
Good. What is your current occupation?
I'm an emergency medicine physician
And how long have you been an emergency medical physician?
since 2013.
And are you at a specific hospital?
I work at a number of hospitals. Currently, I do sort of a travel medicine thing. So I work in South Georgia, rural North Carolina. I work at the VA here in Atlanta sometimes. I bounce around a bit.
And how long have you been doing travel medicine?
Since Atlanta Medical Center closed in the fall of 2022. So about 3 years.
And what did you do before that?
I was an emergency medicine physician working at numerous WellStar hospitals, Atlanta Medical Center, WellStar Paulding, WellStar Cobb, WellStar Douglas. And then before that, I was an emergency medicine resident from 2013 to 2016.
So from 2016 to 2022, you're at the WellStar locations?
Correct.
Okay. And you mentioned the emergency medicine residency.
Yep.
Correct? Where did you do that?
So I went to med school here in Atlanta at Emory, and then after that, I stayed at Emory for emergency medicine residency specialty training. It's a 3-year program from 2013 to 2016. And we work at primarily Grady in the ER, but also at the other Emory hospitals, Emory Maine, Midtown, and children's hospitals like Eggleston and Hugh Spalding as well, predominantly in the ER with some rotations and other specialties.
And what is the purpose of doing the rotations?
At different hospitals?
Yes.
Oh, well, emergency medicine is it's kind of an interesting specialty because you're still a generalist. You see all things that walk in the door, but you specialize in emergencies themselves. So like at a pediatric hospital, you're working at specifically pediatric emergencies. And then at an academic center like Emory, you're seeing a lot of like what we call tertiary care. So like hyper specialized emergencies, like maybe they just had a brain surgery and now something's gone wrong. So they're going to Emory, Maine. Whereas Emory Midtown is more of a traditional community hospital, kind of what you see out in the suburbs or other kind of regular ERs. And then Grady is, level 1 county trauma hospital. It's one of the busiest hospitals in the country, and it's very trauma specialized, very, a good training ground. So each hospital kind of offers something different for the training.
Okay. And how long did you do your rotations at Grady for?
Well, from 2013 to 2016, so it was 3 years.
And I'm sorry, maybe I didn't ask the question
Yeah,
properly
sorry.
then. You mentioned you did multiple rotations.
Oh,
How
yeah,
many rotations did you do at
Sorry,
Grady?
it's on a calendar, so month to month. Yeah,
And would you say the majority of them were at Grady?
correct. Yeah, like about 60, 70%. Yeah.
Okay. And what was your position when you were there?
A resident.
And-
So I was a resident in training for emergency medicine.
Okay. And what does that mean?
So that's after you finish medical school, you choose a specialty, whether that's general surgery, primary care, pediatrics, and then each specialty has a length specific for training in that specific specialty. So you're essentially working to get board certified in emergency medicine, and you have to kind of do a 3-year program, 3 or 4-year program to get signed off to take the boards in that specialty.
Okay. And during your specialty, were you trained to perform sexual assault exams?
Yes.
And what did that training consist of?
We had weekly lectures, throughout the 3 years in residency. And so we had lectures during those, basically there were 6 hours, half the day. And so we had several lectures on sexual assault exams. I believe we had sane nurses who came and kind of walked through the exam with us. And then we did the exams on mock patients. And then after that, as a second year resident, you are in charge of essentially all the sexual assault exams that come in through Grady when you're on shift. So there's always one second year resident on shift at any given time at Grady's ER. And so if a sexual assault case comes in, you're notified by the charge nurse or the nurse that is taking care of that patient that, hey, you have an exam. And so you do a lot in your second year.
Approximately how many sexual assault exams did you perform?
In that year?
Yes.
I didn't keep track and I don't have a log, so this is a bit of a guess, but probably like 30 to 50, quite a bit.
And your second year residency, what year was that?
So that would be 2014 to 2015.
And have you performed any sexual assault exams since leaving Grady?
I have, but not as frequently.
Do you have a roundabout number?
Yeah, so in residency, residents do it, or in hospitals where there's residents do it. And in community ERs, which I work in primarily now, meaning community, not academic teaching centers, not where there's residents and med students, things like that. There's typically a sane nurse, so a sexual assault nurse examiner that does them. So for instance, that's the case at the Wellstar hospitals. If I had that, they do them more often. But I do work in some rural hospitals that don't have that now. It's much less. It's like 1 to 5 a year since leaving residency. And so I've been done with residency since 2016. So, probably 10 to 20 max.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Your Honor, this time I would move to tender Dr. Little as an expert in medicine and sexual assault examinations.
Medicine and?
Sexual assault examinations, yes.
And was the word in between medicine and the others?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Ms. Wood, are you handling this witness?
Yes, sir.
Any objection to having Dr. Little qualified as an expert in the field of medicine, pretty broad, and sexual assault investigations?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, you are so qualified for this trial, Doctor.
Dr. Little, what is the purpose of conducting a sexual assault exam?
The purpose is to collect a history and any genetic evidence for the purposes of, a criminal investigation.
You mentioned genetic evidence. What does that mean?
So when we do the exam, we start obviously by getting the patient's consent and make sure they are okay with the proceedings. We don't do anything in medicine in general without a patient's consent, but this is a particularly kind of traumatizing exam because first we recount the history so we can kind of figure out how the sexual assault happened, and then that sort of leads our exam. So in order to collect any DNA evidence, we start with the kit itself, which is essentially has separate collection things for different swabs. So we'll do.
Let me just
Sorry,
pause you for a second.
Sorry,
Just getting a little ahead of where I want to be. So
yeah.
When a patient arrives at Grady,
Yeah.
what's the procedure
So they'll
for a sexual
check,
assault exam?
yeah, they'll check into a triage nurse and notify, if that's part of their chief complaint, whoever's triaging them realizes it's a potential sexual assault. There will be we had a rape crisis counselor who is essentially a social worker who specialized in sexual assaults, gets notified, and then the second year resident gets notified. And then they generally, as a team, see the patient together and do the history part together. If the police weren't notified already, we'll ask the patient if they want the police notified, and we'll do that as well, and they'll come in as well. And then ideally, all three of these people, the doctor, the counselor, and the police, get the history at once so they don't have to, repeat it multiple times. And then once that part is done, the physician, the resident in that case, would work with a nurse who's primarily acting as a chaperone to do the sexual assault exam.
And why does the nurse act as a chaperone?
Anytime we do, you know, sensitive exams, you know, particularly genital exams, things like that, it's best to have a chaperone present.
And that was standard procedure?
Yeah, that's standard procedure for even non-sexual assault exams.
And what is your role in the sexual assault exam?
So first, there's a medical history, kind of gathering their general medical history, and you know, first and foremost in the emergency department, we're always trying to make sure we're not missing anything, you know, life or limb threatening, and you know, assessing their pain and discomfort and things like that, and any injuries that might have happened. And then again, we get the history, you know, fairly specific details of the sexual assault, so we know kind of what to examine. And we ask the patient to fully undress and fully examine the skin and exterior for any trauma or injuries like that.
Would you note if there was trauma or injuries?
Would I?
Yes.
Yes.
And in your experience, is there always marks when there's trauma that has occurred?
No,
Does there have to be any physical marks when trauma has occurred?
not necessarily, right? I mean, someone can be assaulted physically and it doesn't leave remnants. Like there's not necessarily a bruise or a scratch or something you would see a day later. Right?
And so you mentioned you look at the skin for any trauma. What is the next step?
So the next step is attempting to collect that DNA evidence, which is we do by swabs. So we'll do oral swabs, vaginal swabs, anal swabs if there was anal involvement, and skin swabs, fingernail clippings, hair samples from the patient, and then we do combings to separate any DNA separate from the patient's hair. And then the same with we collect pubic hair and do pubic combings as well.
And where do those swabs come from?
They're all separately, they're in the sexual kit when you open it to begin with. They're all kind of separately in different packets. And so they're all sort of individually collected and placed in the sexual assault kit.
And why is the kit broken up like that?
Just to kind of keep every specimen separate for it to be analyzed later. Yeah.
And I'm showing you it's already been admitted at stage 9. Do you recognize this?
I do.
How do you recognize it?
Well, it's a Georgia sexual assault evidence collection kit, and it's the one that I performed on 8/27/14, or sorry, 8/28/14.
You know you performed that.
Well, I have my name. It's my handwriting, which is classic doctor handwriting, and yeah, so it's got my name there as the examiner and sealed by my name.
And is your initials anyone else on that kit?
Yeah, on the back after we seal it, there's an evidence sticker that you sign there, and you put it over the opening so that it would be broken if tampered with.
I'm sorry, why do you put the sticker there?
It's an evidence sticker so that if it shows that I was the last person to seal it. So if it's opened, then it's been tampered with, I suppose.
And is your signature broken on that one?
Yeah, that's my initials there. Oh, is it broken? It doesn't look like it.
No, that's what the question was.
Yeah.
All right, so there's some things noted on that kit. What kinds of things do you note on the kit?
Up from the outside?
Yes, on the outside of the kit.
Well, so it has the victim's name. Forgive me if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, but Cambria Herring. Her age, 19. We have the race there, African American. I have a suspect's name, which was written as Steve at the time. Age was non-applicable. Race of the suspect, African American, and then date of the assault, 8/27/14. Date of exam, 8/28/14. Time of assault, 3 a.m. Time of exam, 1:25 a.m. The site, Grady Memorial. My name, Kevin D. Little. Sealed by Kevin D. Little, and then released by Kenya Forge, and then released to Detective Cabin, East Point Police.
Why is that biographical information noted on the kit?
Well, there's a chain of custody of kind of who was in possession of the kit and who performed the kit.
Why would you note a suspect's information on a kit?
Why would I note it?
Yes.
Oh, to identify who the exam was performed on.
Where do the suspect information? Where do you
Oh,
get
sorry,
them?
the suspect. Sorry, I thought you meant the victim. The suspects, I'm not sure why that's there. But,
Why? Where would you get that information from? Where do you get them?
I think when you ask the patient, do you know their name, maybe, or did you know their name, when you're doing the exam?
And there, you said there's no age listed on there. Why would there be no age listed on there?
Presumably she didn't know, or I didn't know at the time. Yeah.
And let's go back to the actual sexual assault exam.
Okay.
How, after these swabs are taken, what's the next step?
Well, kind of after each specific swab is taken, it goes into a sealed paper envelope, similar to that, but smaller. So kind of everyone's kind of familiar with like a COVID swab. They look similar to that for oral swabs and vaginal swabs, and they're sort of sub-sealed in a separate paper that goes into that.
And why are they sub-sealed and then put in there?
So they don't mix in it's in the bag, and then so that it's all sort of sealed and there's no other DNA or other, evidence kind of getting in contact with it by the time it gets to the folks who analyze it.
And after you take all the swabs, seal them, put them in the kit, what is your next part of your exam?
Well, it's kind of an exam and a collection process all at once.
Okay.
Can
Can you please explain?
Yeah. So like I said, first the patient's fully undressed and you just kind of do a cursory skin exam. And then at that point I kind of do less invasive to more invasive. So just a skin exam, and then I'll collect their hair samples, comb their hair. And those are two separate samples, their hair and then the combings. And then do the oral swabs. And then after that, pubic hair collection, and then pubic hair combings. Those are two separate samples. And then we do a pelvic exam, which is when we use a speculum. Well, first you examine the outside of the vagina, and then for any trauma, things like that, or, blood or dried semen, things like that. And if there's anything like that, you try to collect that. And then you do a speculum exam using speculum to basically enlarge the vaginal wall, and then do swabs from inside the vagina, and also look inside the vagina for any signs of trauma. And then collect those swabs and then fingernail clippings as well. Sorry, before that. That's mostly it.
Okay. And do you independently recollect every single sexual assault exam you've performed in your career?
I mean, the specifics, no.
And then is that the reason why you make notes?
Yeah. I mean, we document pretty heavily in all medical encounters, but specifically there's actually two separate notes we do with these. We have our sort of medical note that is more related to any like traumas or injuries, and also we test for STDs as kind of like a baseline, and then we also treat empirically, and we also give Plan B if the patient wants it. And so that's kind of the medical side. And then there's a whole separate note for the sexual assault exam that's a little more like algorithmic, kind of like yes, no, that we kind of go through for the history and the exam part.
And did you have the opportunity to review your notes in this case?
I did, yeah.
And what stood out to you about this case?
Well, initially that it was a long time ago. And I again don't remember specifics. It was so long ago, but I do vaguely remember the parts of the history. Like I don't remember what the victim looked like or anything like that, but I kind of remember the story a little bit.
Why is that?
The part about and this is in the history about, I remember a part about a patient being near a MARTA station and being approached by someone from that MARTA station and taken to an abandoned house. That story was just kind of, I don't know, it sort of stuck with me.
Do you remember, I know you say you don't remember what she looks like. Do you remember what her affect was like?
I do remember that she was like very like withdrawn, soft-spoken, very like emotionally affected. And that's part of the reason, like the story was very specific and she was very soft-spoken and it just seemed like more powerful in that way. I do remember that.
And about her physical, or what else did you learn about the incident while taking your history, if anything?
Well, you know, that what I just said is kind of all I remember from like my memory. The rest I'm going to remember from reviewing the notes.
If you
know?
looked at the
Yeah.
notes, would it refresh your recollection?
What's that?
If you reviewed your notes, would it refresh your recollection?
Sure. Yeah. You're just asking what else do I remember about the encounter?
But what else did you learn while taking your history about what happened in this case, this exam?
Right. So history-wise, I mean, I remember her being pretty detailed in the kind of her report of what had happened leading up to the sexual assault. Like I said, she was quite late, was, you know, an argument with her sister, was walking around near the train station or was going to the train station and approached by this man who was pretty, I guess like forward, and it sounds like propositioned her. And then began, you know, verbally threatening her.
I'm gonna have that judge. It seems that he's just reading what she said in the exam. It's hearsay.
Okay, Ms. Reimer?
The medical records are self-authenticating, Your Honor. He's reading his notes and refreshing his recollection. I can ask him to instead read, and then I can ask him the question about it, if that would cure it.
So that would address the format concern that Ms. Wood raised, but of course, it sounds to me like, and you can clear it up if I'm mistaken, that Dr. Little's basis for the information would be things he heard
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Herring say. So we've got the format, he's just reading from a document, and he is relaying, it appears to be things Ms. Herring said. So if you can navigate through hearsay and format, we can keep going.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Sure can.
What he learned was for medical treatment, which would be an exception to hearsay.
If it's relevant to medical treatment, one of the things that I heard the doctor just say is that someone was being forward. I'm not sure how that impacts medical treatment. Maybe when she is describing, if she did in that narrative, here's physically what happened to me, that would be germane to medical treatment. But the lead in, I'm going to sustain the objection on hearsay.
Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Little, reviewing the notes, what did you learn that was relevant to your treatment of Ms. Herring?
Okay. So essentially she stated that she was, you know, forced against her will to have vaginal sex. And
Why was that relevant to your treatment of her?
well, it's, you know, the indication for a sexual assault exam.
Okay.
Yeah.
You can continue.
And so she reported she was raped vaginally, as well as forced to perform oral sex, which is also relevant for doing oral swabs.
I'm going to pause you for a second.
Sure.
Are those notes kept at or during the time of your treatment?
Yeah. You mean, sorry, yeah, I'm taking them essentially
Okay.
either immediately after or even during if I have a computer with me.
Yes, Your Honor. Or yes, thank you.
Sure.
Your Honor, I would enter the medical records as a self-authenticating document, as well as a business record.
Is this states 10?
States 10, Your Honor, yes.
All right, Ms. Wood, any objection to states 10 being admitted?
No, Judge.
They are admitted.
Okay. What did you note about the trauma to the vaginal area?
So I just remember this from reviewing it before. I noted blood in the vaginal vault as the only kind of abnormality in the vaginal exam.
What is a vaginal vault?
It's essentially the back or the posterior of the vagina that's larger than the anterior or the front of the vagina, so fluid can collect there.
And how did you view that?
Yeah, that's what you're viewing with the speculum exam. You're essentially opening the anterior vagina to look at the
Can you
posterior
explain what a
vagina.
speculum is?
Speculum is a metal or plastic medical tool that we place into the orifice of the vagina, and then it opens like this to kind of create a potential space to do swabs or exams through, basically.
Okay. And what does blood in the vaginal vault indicate to you?
It can indicate like trauma to the inside of the vagina that had blood had collected there from trauma from the vaginal walls. It can indicate menstruation. Those are probably the two main things.
If she was menstruating, would you note that in the medical records?
We ask when the last menstrual period was, and we ask if they're currently menstruating, which I believe in this case she was not currently menstruating, and that her last menstrual period was. I'd have to double check when that was in relation to the exam.
Okay, so in your opinion, is it safe to say it was not menstruation blood?
According to her not being on her menstruation at that time, yes.
Okay. And do you always see trauma to the vaginal area during sexual assault exams?
No.
And why is that?
Well, sex does not necessarily cause trauma to the vaginal wall. Like penetration does not necessarily cause trauma to the inside of the vagina.
One moment. And so it doesn't, you said sex doesn't necessarily cause trauma to the vaginal area. Why is that?
I mean, it's sex essentially is not or even an assault is not inherently like an event that traumas the tissue of the inside of the vagina. Basically, doesn't.
Is that because of the nature of a vagina?
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
What does that mean? What's the nature of
there
vagina?
are two soft things that come in contact with each other. It's unless, there's very forceful, very, very forceful, or there's like foreign objects used. And, there isn't necessarily damage or injury to the inside of the vagina with, penetration from a penis.
So what would seeing trauma in the vaginal area indicate to you?
That it can be either forceful sex or, a vagina that maybe wasn't very lubricated during sex, like rough sex, essentially.
Do you remember if you were present when the social worker interviewed Miss Herring?
I don't. Like I said earlier, I typically would try to do that at the same time to limit the amount of, trauma to the patient recounting the experience.
Based on your review of the medical records, is what you learned similar to what the social worker learned?
Yes.
History-wise?
Yeah, just reading her note, my note, they seem quite similar.
May I have one moment, Yana?
Yes.
Dr. Little, your exam in this situation, is that consistent with someone who's experienced sexual assault?
It can be, yes. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Based on your notes, is what you did consistent with what you would do for a victim of sexual assault?
What I would do?
Yes,
Yes.
for an exam. No further questions, Judge.
Ms. Wood, questions for Dr. Little?
Just a few, Judge. Good afternoon, Dr. Little. Thanks for being with us.
Of course.
It's fair to say that part of this exam, you rely on Ms. Herring's self-reporting, correct?
For the history portion, yes.
Okay. And there are other explanations for why there could be blood in the vaginal vault, right?
Correct.
Okay. And so the only evidence that you have of it not being period blood is Cambria's word, right?
Yeah, and her reported not being on her menstruation in her last menstrual period. Yeah.
Thank you so much. No further questions.
Ms. Reimer, anything else?
Okay.
Questions from the jurors? Yes. All right, take your time. I don't know if we lost Deputy Gordon. You may get to be the card collector. He looks nervous. Mr. Gordon. They have questions. And your colleague didn't want to collect. It's a specialized role.
I could have done it.
A specialty. Those will wait. Thank you. All right, doctor, please explain one more time to the jury what you would view as signs of a sexual assault. Not words of I was assaulted, but then you're examining and say, okay, that's consistent with there having been a sexual assault.
Well, one thing I just want to clarify is that you can have a completely normal exam and have a sexual assault. I mean, it's that's one thing that's kind of harped on us in emergency medicine in general. Is there doesn't have to be signs of physical trauma for there to be a sexual assault. Not every sexual assault victim is, essentially physical or fights back or, is injured.
You could find nothing out of the ordinary in a patient, and that patient's version of events could be completely consistent with that.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
When you do find physical evidence on a patient that is consistent with a sexual assault, what is it that you find?
Well, there's no way to be certain when things like bruising and abrasions and things like that happen in a timeline, right? I'm just seeing one slice of time. But if someone, says they've been sexually assaulted and it was a very physical encounter to trying to resist that sexual assault, like as in they were, held by the wrists or strangled, you would see bruising in however, the victim was injured, if they were strangled or held or ropes or whatever was involved, you would see, signs of trauma from that. But it's not necessary, but that is sometimes what you might see in a very physical sexual assault.
You mentioned bruising, and there's a
Right.
question about that. Based on your training and experience, you had a time frame documented on the assault kit, which has gone away from you, but it was reported that the assault occurred, I think it was 3 a.m. And then you were seeing the patient the following 1 a.m.
Yeah, it was roughly 24 hours.
So a little less than 24 hours, about
Yeah.
22 hours. Based on your training and experience, is 22 hours enough time for bruising to have become visible to your trained eye? You're gonna say it depends, but tell us it depends on what?
It depends on the severity of the bruising, to be honest. Yeah. And honestly, the patient themselves and their propensity to bruising. I mean, we all know folks that can bump their arm and have a bruise, and then other folks that can take a pretty good hit and not bruise at all. So there's a lot of variables involved in that, and none that I think you can make like deductions based
Okay.
on, you know.
Is it possible from your training experience that bruises could have developed after you were done with your exam? Or there's no way a bruise would come 28 hours after the physical contact?
I think possible, but unlikely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Were you able to tell from your physical exam where you noted blood in the vaginal vault, if that was consistent with someone being on her cycle at that time, versus there was trauma in that area?
Hard to differentiate in the time. Yeah.
What about a report of, you report somewhere there was tenderness was reported. Is that less consistent with it being on cycle and more consistent with trauma, or it could be either?
I don't recall reporting that there was tenderness, unless that's in my note.
Okay. Would the victim experience tenderness if it had been a physical assault versus it was cycle?
Yes, more likely to have a tender vagina after a physical sexual assault.
Okay. Were there any medical tests that could have been performed to say, oh, this is blood coming from the menstrual cycle versus trauma or an abrasion or something on the interior?
Possibly none that were available to me at the time. Yeah.
Okay. That wouldn't have been a
Yeah.
standard part of the sexual assault examination you did?
No.
Okay. Does the sexual assault kit include taking photos of anything to document, oh, here was a bruise here or no bruise there?
You know, that's typically, in my experience, done by the investigators.
Meaning law enforcement as
Yeah.
opposed to medicine?
Correct. You know, and now currently with like more technology and electronic medical records, and you can add photos to the medical chart more easily from your phone through HIPAA sensitive apps and things like that. That was non-existent 10 years ago. So it may be more common now.
But back then, no.
But back then, no.
Okay. Do you know why the kit that you collected was not sent to the GBI until 2016 if you collected it in 2014?
Oh, my understanding is for funding, state funding, and
It wasn't because
funding.
you kept it in a desk drawer in your
No, yeah.
office until 2016?
No. I mean, I put it in where it's supposed to go, and kind of what happens after that is a bit out of my domain. But my understanding is there was like a lack of funding for the sexual assault kits, and they got suddenly a lot of funding in the last, I don't know, however many years, and now sort of addressing these cold cases. So.
All right. Ms. Reimer, any questions for Dr. Little based on that?
Yes, Your Honor.
That wasn't it. You mentioned you did what you were supposed to do with the kit.
Yeah.
Can you please tell me what that is?
There's a locked locker in what we call the 49 exam room, and 49 is a colloquial term or a term we use in the medical for sexual assault exams that's sort of unidentified. You know, it's like, so we can say it without anyone's privacy. So there's a 49 room, and there's a locker in there that you lock it, and with
Is
the
that
other
room
kids.
secured?
Yeah, yeah, the room is locked and then the locker is locked.
And, you released the kid to somebody, correct?
Well,
Or tell me.
Um,
You did what you're supposed to do, you put it in the room?
yeah, I think I put it in the room and lock it, and I think the release by is whoever gets it later, I believe.
During that
Yeah,
time, it stays in there.
yeah, yeah,
Release.
yeah. Or that might have been the nurse that I did it with. I'm not exactly sure that second line, to be frank with you, but it goes in the locker.
And is there ever any deviation from that process?
At Grady, no, it always went in the locker.
Did you ever deviate from that process?
No.
To read this line. Release two.
One more time with the kid. Can you please tell me who the kid was released to?
Well, release 2 would be the detective,
Name.
P. Caven, if I'm reading that right.
What police department?
East Point.
So after it's released to East Point, it's in there, right?
Out of the medical world. Yeah.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Ms. Wood?
Thank you, Judge.
You didn't note any evidence of any tearing, correct?
No vaginal tearing. I do believe there was some, now that we can review the notes or I can review it, but I remember there's some like scratch marks to her back or something like that, or abrasions on one of my
But it-
physical exams.
All right.
No vaginal tearing. if that's
Okay,
what-
no vaginal tearing, no abrasions on the vagina,
No.
no scratches near the vagina,
Nope.
and you didn't observe any bruising.
In the vagina, no.
Thank you.
Dr. Little, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Ms. Reimer?
The state calls Nicole Carroll.
Can you face me and raise your right hand? You swear affirm that the testimony you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, self you got.
I did.
You can lower your hand, have a seat. Can you state and spell your name correct?
Nicole Carroll, NicoleCarroll.
Good afternoon, Ms. Carroll.
Good afternoon.
What is your current occupation?
I am a quality technical leader.
And what does that mean?
So I help take care of the lab's quality issues. So I make sure we meet our accreditation standards. I help make sure that we're meeting compliance to all our audits. I help make sure that if something is done incorrectly, that we handle it appropriately and do the proper channels and things like that.
You mentioned a lab. What lab is that?
I work for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, Division of Forensic Science, which is also known as the State Crime Lab.
And how long have you been there?
10 years in April.
And before you were a quality technician, what was your role?
When I first started on at the GBI, I was hired on as a forensic DNA analyst. And what that means is I worked cases for DNA.
And what was your educational background before you started at the GBI?
I received a bachelor's of science in cellular and molecular biology from Auburn University in 2012. I then went on to get a master's of science in forensic genetics from the University of North Texas Health Science Center in 2015.
Do you have any specialized training in DNA?
Yes, after being hired on by the GBI, I underwent a year-long training program in which I had to learn all the policies and procedures of the lab. I had to do all the testing processes on mock samples. I had to take written, oral, and practical exams. And at the end, you have to take a final competency test, which is you basically do a case from beginning to end, and you have to do it 100% accurately.
And are there any ongoing trainings that you conducted or conduct for DNA training?
Yes, so as a DNA analyst, we are required to have continuing education hours. So this means we have to attend conferences, we have to go to webinars and make sure we're staying up to date on scientific technologies, methods, processes. We also have to read scientific journal articles to make sure, again, we're keeping up with our scientific knowledge and foundation.
And are you familiar with the DNA testing process at the GBI?
Yes.
And what is that?
So at the GBI, the DNA testing process starts with taking a cutting from a sample. Most of the time, the samples are swabs like Q-tips. You're going to place that small cutting into a tube, and we're going to add some chemicals to release the DNA. We then determine how much DNA is present in that sample. And depending on the type of case, that could be dependent on whether or not we're looking for male DNA or just DNA in general. Then after that, we make copies of the DNA at specific locations to get a profile. We do that for both unknown samples or crime scene samples, and we do the same thing to also any known reference samples that we have in the case. At the end, we compare those profiles to each other to see if anything matches to a person, and then we'll issue a report with any of our findings.
And have you previously testified as an expert in DNA analysis?
Yes,
About how many times?
about 35 times.
Is that in the state of Georgia?
Yes.
And Your Honor, at this time, I would like to tender Ms. Carroll as an expert in forensic DNA analysis.
Okay.
Ms. Carroll, you're qualified as an expert in the field of forensic DNA analysis.
Did you have the opportunity to conduct a review of the sexual assault kit of Ms. Cambria Herring?
Yes.
And did you author a report on that DNA analysis?
Yes, I did.
It's showing you it's been previously marked as states 14. Do you recognize that?
Yes, I do.
How do you recognize that?
This is the report I issued in this case, and I know that by the unique GBI case number on the report, as well as my signature at the end of the report.
And is that the report that you generated in this analysis?
Yes.
Your Honor, the state would move into evidence with previously marked as states 14.
Is feeling any objection to states 14?
This is, as she herself conducted, correct?
That was my understanding, but you're welcome to examine the witness just on the issue of the admissibility of 14.
Yes, I know.
Okay, 14 is admitted.
Was a DNA analysis requested on this case?
Yes, it was.
And can you please tell us what DNA is?
DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It is the genetic blueprint that makes us who we are. You get half from your mom and half from your dad, and it's unique to each individual with the exception of identical siblings.
And how is DNA transferred?
DNA can be transferred in a number of ways. Most commonly is through bodily fluids. So you have DNA in your blood, semen, saliva. You also have DNA in your skin cells. So for example, if you touch something and you leave some skin cells behind, you may also leave your DNA. DNA can also be found in your hair. So there's a multiple ways that could happen.
And how do you do the test for DNA?
Like I said, we take that cutting and from the sample. So in this case, it was a swab. So again, like a Q-tip, I just took some scissors and I cut off a little piece on that swab, place it into the tube, add the chemicals I need to get that DNA, and then continue through the process and see if we even had DNA on that sample, how much DNA if we did, and then generate those profiles so I can then continue with my interpretation.
What kind of swabs were they in this case?
In this case specifically, I tested what was labeled as vaginal cervical swabs.
And what's the first test you conduct on those vaginal cervical swabs?
So that first test is the extraction process, where we're trying to get the DNA from those swabs, and then we move on to the quantification process. And that is where we're determining if there was any DNA present, because sometimes there's not, and if there is, how much there is. Since this was a alleged sexual assault case, what we're specifically looking for, since it was a female victim in this case, is there male DNA present? If so, then we'll move forward in the process. If there is no male DNA, that answers that first question in this case.
And was there male DNA present in this case?
Yes.
I'm showing you it's been entered as states 9. Do you recognize this?
Yes.
Why, how do you recognize it?
It has the unique GBI barcode and with the unique GBI case number and item number. And it has the different initials and seals of any individual at the GBI who handled the evidence.
And why, is the kit sealed and initialed by anyone who handles evidence?
So it's part of the chain of custody. So we're aware at all times who has handled the evidence and when. So each initial corresponds to a time this would have been open and handled by somebody and dated when they did that.
Um, I'm going to backtrack a second to the male DNA that you extracted in this exam. How did you know it was male DNA?
During our quantification process, so that is the step where we're determining if DNA is present, and if so, how much. We have the ability to look at just DNA overall. So how much DNA is present in the sample, and that would be both female and male. We don't have a differentiation there. But we have also a specific marker in our kit that looks at just male DNA. So that's how we're able to know that there is male DNA present at that step.
And that's what you did in this case?
Yes.
What was the two samples the two DNA profiles that you extracted in this kit?
So from this kit specifically, I extracted the known reference sample from Cambria herring. And then I also tested the vaginal cervical swabs as labeled as coming from her. Yeah, those were the two samples I tested in this case.
And how many individuals did you note that DNA was present in the kit?
On the vaginal cervical swabs, there were 2 individuals that we were able to obtain from that sample. Since I had a known from the victim, I was able to compare those profiles to her. One of those profiles did match her. And then I have a second unknown male profile.
And what do you do when you have a second unknown profile that's male?
In this instance, if it meets a certain set of criteria, I can enter that profile into the DNA database, and it can be searched against other profiles in an attempt to provide answers to the agency.
Does it have to meet a certain criteria?
Yes.
And did this sample meet that criteria?
Yes, it did.
Was that sample entered?
Yes.
What is your next step after that?
After that, we wait to see if there is any sort of match in that database. If that happens, there is a process in place for another individual to review and ensure that that match does indeed make sense with the evidence we have, the DNA profiles we obtained. If that is the case, we let the agency know that there was a match, and then we ask for a known reference sample from said individual, and they have to submit that in order for us to then compare that to the evidence.
Is your work peer reviewed at any point?
Yes.
And why is that?
We always have a second qualified analyst review our work, and that is because we're human. Errors can happen. So we always have another individual go through. They review all the notes, all our data, all our interpretation, our report. They make sure that everything was done correctly and according to policy, that all our controls that we have at each step of the process to let us know that it did in fact work like they were supposed to, and that they also agree with the fact that I said it was 2 individuals. They agree that there's 2 individuals. They agree with the match that I made. They agree that this profile could go into the database and that it did meet that criteria. So no report is released until that process is finished, and there is an agreement that everything was done correctly and the interpretation is correct.
And after your report was peer reviewed, what's the next step?
At that point, the report goes out, and I no longer had any involvement in this case after this.
And to your, was every policy and procedure followed in your analysis in this case?
Yes.
No further questions, Your Honor?
Ms. Feely, questions for Ms. Carroll?
In this case, you examined just the 2 cervical swabs, is that right?
There was the cervical swabs and then the victim's known reference sample from Cambria herring.
And I think you testified humans give off DNA pretty regularly as we move through the world. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
So it would be evident in a hair sample, for instance.
Yes.
or a fingernail clipping.
Yes,
You could even swab things like a knife, right?
A
correct.
what?
A knife, sorry. You could get samples of DNA off of clothing, right?
Correct.
Or off of bedding.
Yes,
And saliva also would have testable amounts of DNA in some cases.
yes.
And in this case, what you've testified to is all the evidence that you were asked to test in this case.
That is correct.
Thank you.
Mr. Reimer?
No, Your Honor.
All right, jurors? Ms. Carroll, what was the date of your analysis, the work that you did? When did that happen?
Can I refer to my notes, Your Honor?
Please.
So the testing started on this case in September 2018.
And when did it finish?
It would have been finished when the report was released, which would have been October 11th, 2018.
Does DNA expire? By which I mean, if the swabs were taken in 2014, August 2014, is there a risk that if we're waiting until September of 2018, the swabs are just going to be swabs now, and you're not able to lift from the swabs any potential DNA that they had picked up? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
So, no. So as long as the samples are maintained under a controlled environment and stored properly, the DNA can be good for as long as the sample is maintained for. Now, if the samples were held outside in the Georgia humidity for the summer for 3 months, yes, there's something called DNA degradation. And what that means is the DNA will break down over time. We can still get DNA, it will just be smaller amounts of DNA. So it just depends on how well the sample was maintained. So in this instance, the sexual assault kit was maintained properly. We know that through the packaging. We know that at GBI, we store it in the conditions needed to maintain that integrity of the evidence so it will not degrade. We can also see that in our data if we do see degradation. So we have ways to know that that has happened and ways to deal with it. But in this case, that did not happen.
There was no evidence of DNA degradation.
That is correct.
And when you say degrade, is there a risk that if there's a swab with my DNA on it and then it degrades some, all of a sudden it looks like it's Derek Jeter's DNA because just some things changed and it looks like someone else's DNA, or it's still mine, it's a bad version of it, if that makes sense? It doesn't become physically wouldn't become someone else's DNA, but the profile just wouldn't match mine anymore because some of it degraded, but now it coincidentally matches someone else's.
That would not happen. Your DNA does not change over time. So when I say degrade, I mean we're chopping it up into smaller and smaller pieces to where our process doesn't work anymore. So think of taking like a spaghetti noodle and then like breaking it in half and then breaking it down some more. So you still have spaghetti noodle. That was the original spaghetti noodle. It's just now in smaller pieces. So it's harder for us to put together and get that profile. But it does not change the profile we get. We just get what we call a partial profile. And I'll explain that. We look at 24 different locations on the DNA to obtain that profile. So when I say partial, we just may get DNA from 12 of those locations instead of 24. But you know that also because if we did have a known to compare that unknown profile to, that statistic that would be issued would tell you kind of the severity of that match. So if we have our full profile, that number is going to be very large. It's going to be bigger than the world's population, multiple Earths over. If there's degradation and we're missing information, that number becomes much, much smaller. So you may see or have a match that's, yes, they match person A, but that stat says it's 1 in 1,000. And that's how you know that the information we got is limited and we're not as confident about the exclusivity of the DNA profile we got.
Do you get to select which sample you're going to test, or does everything in the rape kit get tested?
At this time, we've kind of gone through a different version of operating standards, kind of as we've grown as the lab and trying to deal with the sexual assault kit backlogs. So at this time, what would happen was when we got the sexual assault kits with a female victim and a suspected male assailant, we would select one swab out of each kit to test that that would be the quote best sample to test. So, and provide that answer. So in this case, the vaginal cervical swabs are going to be the most ideal sample to start with. If that did not,
Why is that? Why is that the most ideal sample?
it's the one that's going to yield a profile based, not yield. It's the one that will give us information to answer the questions that were asked. So usually the question asked is, hey, there's this victim that was allegedly assaulted by this man vaginally. So in that case, we want to test the vaginal cervical swabs to see if there is male DNA there.
As opposed to an oral swab, which might tell you there's someone else's DNA in this woman's mouth. That doesn't mean that the other part of what this woman relayed happened necessarily happened.
Correct. So we're trying to make sure we're picking samples that answer the case questions presented to us at the time. So there could also have been an instance where if a sexual assault occurs and that in that sexual assault, they say that there was oral sodomy, we're going to test for oral swabs because that is the case question being asked for us to test and answer. That does not mean we can't go back and test the other samples in the kit. They're always here for us to test if need be, and they may get tested if the first samples we pick up front don't provide information to the agencies for that information.
Are you able to answer the question how likely it would be that the vaginal swab would yield DNA from someone other than the actual woman if there hadn't been vaginal penetration?
DNA other than the victim on the swab if there had not been vaginal
Right,
penetration.
is that a possibility? Or is that something so remote that you all don't consider that? Or is that not your field? You just say there's DNA in there and it's not my job to say how it got there. It's just not the woman's DNA that's in there, and other people will sort through what is the significance that someone else's DNA was inside a woman there.
So the scope of my testing and expertise is I can tell you there's DNA there. I can tell you whose DNA it is. Depending on the testing, I may be able to give an opinion about what source that DNA came from, if I think it is from semen or saliva or blood, something like that. But as to when it got there or how, that's not as accurate because how could be multiple ways. As well as when we do know that the vaginal cavity has enzymes in it to break down any foreign DNA in it. So that is why after a certain amount of days since an incident, it can be harder and harder to collect any DNA that may have been present if it was there. And studies have been done to show that. So we know that there is a time frame around between the incident and getting that collection. But outside of that, I can't give you any more specifics.
You used the term known match and unknown match. Can you explain to the jurors what a known, maybe you didn't use those terms, but someone thought you used the term known match and unknown match. What do those terms mean?
So when I say unknown, that means that's coming from the crime scene sample. So in this case, that's the profiles coming from the vaginal cervical swabs. If I say known, that means it's coming from an individual. So what I mean by that is if I walked up to you and said, hey, I need your known reference sample, you would say, yep, I can do that for you. And basically I'm taking a Q-tip again and I'm swabbing the inside of your cheek and I know that's your DNA, so I can use that to compare to my unknown samples. In this case, we only had one known reference sample, which was from Cambria Herring. So that's why I'm able to tell you that one of those two profiles I got from the unknown sample is Cambria, but then I had no further reference samples in this case to compare that second profile to, which is why it's an unknown profile.
So someone at the GBI did additional work on this case to try to sort out to whom the unknown profile belongs. That's not you.
Yes, the next person coming up is the one who received that additional reference sample, did the work, and then issued the findings on that comparison.
Got it. Ms. Reimer, do you have any other questions for Ms. Carroll?
Briefly, Your Honor. Ms. Carroll, you mentioned the sexual assault kit backlog. What was that?
A couple of years ago, more years than that now, it's already 2025. It was found out that there was a large amount of sexual assault kits that had not been tested. I'm sure y'all heard about it. It was all over the news. And so at the GBI, we worked really hard to figure out the best way to test all these as efficiently as possible and try to provide answers to these cases, these victims' families, and any even alleged assailant who may or may not have been wrongly blamed for an assault. So during that time, we had to kind of put our heads together and figure out the best way to test these samples and give the best answers we could and make sure that we were testing as many as possible. So that is why, in this case, we only tested the one sample up front. And since it did provide us information, that was why it was the only one tested at the time. So we could continue to test all the other kits to try and provide as many answers and closure as we could.
So based on the testing dates, this kit was part of that backlog?
Yes.
I have no further questions.
Ms. Feely, any other questions? No. Ms. Carroll, thank you for your time. So Ms. Reimer, I know there was one more witness you were hoping to get through. Do you think we get through that witness by 5-ish?
Yes. I think, yeah.
Let's go for it.
All right, the state calls Ronald Schmidt. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, raise your right hand. You swear or affirm that testimony you will give the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. I do. Go ahead, have a seat. Can you state and spell your name for the record?
Ronald Schmidt, RONALD SCHMIDT.
Good afternoon, Mr. Schmidt. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. Where are you currently employed?
I'm employed by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation in the Division of Forensic Science in the Forensic Biology Department.
And what is your position there?
I'm a crime lab scientist
How long have you been in that position?
since June 1st of 2012.
And is that how long you've been with the GBI?
It is.
Okay. And where did you go to school?
So I have a bachelor's degree in chemistry with a minor in biology. That's from Lemoyne College in Syracuse, New York. And I have a master's degree with concentrations in DNA analysis, forensic chemistry, and crime scene investigation from Marshall University in Huntington, West Virginia.
And besides your degree, do you have any specialized training in DNA analysis?
I have passed the GBI training program that takes about a year that includes oral, written, practical examinations. I'm also certified by the American Board of Criminalistics in molecular biology.
And do you do any ongoing trainings for DNA analysis?
Yes, we do literature reviews and then proficiency tests twice a year,
And what's the purpose of doing those?
just to stay up to date and prove that we're still competent in what we do.
In your position as a forensic biologist, what are your duties and responsibilities?
So I receive evidence from state and local agencies. I screen it for bodily fluids, namely blood, semen, saliva, perform DNA analysis, and testify.
And are you familiar with the DNA testing process at the GBI?
I am.
Have you testified before regarding DNA analysis?
I have.
As an expert?
Yes.
How many times?
It's getting toward 100, probably in the high 90s.
And is that in the state of Georgia?
It is. And twice in federal court in downtown.
Okay. Your Honor, I would like to tender Mr. Schmidt as an expert in forensic DNA analysis.
Stephen, no objection. All right, Mr. Schmidt, you're approaching number 100. You are an expert for the purposes of this trial in the field of forensic DNA analysis.
Thank you.
Did you do a DNA analysis in this case?
I did.
And what was that analysis?
So I examined a known sample through the regular DNA testing procedures and then compared to data previously generated.
And did you author a report based on your work?
I did.
I'm showing you it's been previously marked as state 16. Do you recognize that?
I do.
How do you recognize it?
So this is the report issued by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation with the relevant case number and then my signature at the bottom of the report.
And is that the report you authored in this case?
It is.
Your Honor, the state would move into evidence what's been previously marked as states
16?
16, thank you.
Ms. Peel, any objection to states 15?
No.
I mean 16. 16 is admitted.
I'm showing you what's been previously marked as states 12. Do you recognize this?
I never personally interacted with this evidence item, but it is marked with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation sticker that we use to track evidence to the laboratory.
States 13.
So again, this would be the evidence item that I compared to the previous data. I didn't, however, actually interact with this evidence. This was done by one of our technicians, Vasuda. It's an Indian last name. It's hard to pronounce, so I always forget how to pronounce it, but she's one of our technicians.
So this is the kit that was analyzed and you did the DNA analysis off of that kit.
It is.
Your Honor, the state would enter in states 13 and 12.
Ms. Feely, any objection to the admission of 12 and 13?
I may have misheard, but I thought one of them these testified non-interact with.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just wondering if you've got an objection to the admission to either 12 or 13.
No objection to the one that he has personal knowledge of, but we do object to the one that he does not.
Okay, I'll admit 13, 12 will hold to the side.
Yes, Your Honor. You compared the a sample in this case, correct?
Yes, so I compared the known of the victim and the known of the subject to the previous data.
So the known of the victim, where did you get that information from?
So that would have been generated on the previous report.
Is that from the one that Ms. Carroll generated?
Correct.
Is that from the sexual assault kit?
Yes.
Okay. And the other sample, where did you get that sample from?
So that was our item 3, would be the victim or the sample of the subject that Vasuda had extracted.
And who was that from?
That was from Jay Williams.
And what kind of sample was that?
That was just a buccal swab, so a cheek swab.
Can you explain what a buccal swab is? Cheek swab. So how is that taken?
So it's cheek swab. Buccal stands for buccal cell. It's the type of cells that line your cheeks. So it's just, they take something that looks like a Q-tip and just insert it into your mouth and rubs it along the cheeks to collect cells that we then get DNA from.
And why is a buccal swab used use for comparison?
It's just a really easy way to collect DNA from an individual.
Can you please explain what you did in this case for the analysis with the buccal swab?
So let me go back to how DNA is done. We take a sample, we take a cutting of it, separate the DNA from the other cellular material, find out how much DNA there is, amplify certain locations on it, and then generate DNA profiles. So Ms. Vasuda did the extraction, and then one of our technicians did the quantification. That's the first two steps. The last two, making the copies and generating the DNA profile, I performed. And then obviously the comparisons to the previous sample.
And I'm sorry, did you say who the sample belonged to?
Jay Williams.
And what was the amplification that you did in this case?
So that's where we take a commercial kit, which then makes copies of 24 different locations on the DNA that we use to generate a DNA profile.
And what did you learn about this one?
About that known versus the other sample?
I'm sorry, what the sample in the buccal swab, this sample states 13 versus the unknown in the sexual assault kit.
So one of the profiles that was found in the sexual assault kit matched the profile generated from Jay Williams.
And how do you know that?
So when we make those copies, we're making copies of small sections of DNA that don't code for genes. They're just basically junk DNA, but it's what we call short tandem repeats. We have sections of 4 nucleotides that are repeated a number of times. So when we generate a profile, we just get a number for the number of repeats. So when we generate a DNA profile, it looks sort of like an EKG. It's these lines with peaks on them. Those peaks are labeled with integer numbers. So when you generate a DNA profile from an unknown and a known, it's sort of like if you had an overhead, you can just overlay them and they would be the same.
And are there spots on that you look to compare?
Yeah, so we look at 24 locations. They're generated, or they were chosen by the company that makes the kit. So we use whatever they give us to make copies of, but they were chosen along with the FBI and different stakeholders in DNA analysis.
And did you look at the 24 locations in this case?
We did.
And what did you see?
That one of the profiles in the unknown matched the profile of Jay Williams.
And what was the number, if you can, the frequency that you would expect to see that again?
So the collection of results that we saw in the unknown would happen once every 100 octillion individuals.
And that sounds like a big number. What is that number?
So that's a 1 with 29 zeros. The population of the Earth is about 7.5 billion. It's a little more now. That would be a 7 with essentially 9 zeros.
And so what does that mean? Would you expect to see this again?
So the population of the Earth is 9 zeros. I did a quick calculation this morning. It'd take, I think, 13 quintillion Earths, which would be 15 zeros. I mean, it's just a very, very large number. We're talking about grains on all the beaches in the world. It's a huge number.
Okay. And because that number is so large, does that indicate there was any degradation in the kit?
Those are two different things.
Okay.
So degraded DNA and the stat that's generated don't really correlate in that manner.
Okay. Would you see any degradation in this kit?
I didn't look at the profile recently. There's no indication from here, given that it was a full match to Mr. Williams, that there was any degradation.
You said it was
Typically, if there was degradation, some of those locations would drop out, and we'd indicate it was a partial profile, which we didn't do.
so it was a full profile in this case?
It appears so, yes.
And after you do that analysis, and what do you do next? Anything?
We just write the report and issue it, and then report to court when asked.
Is it peer reviewed?
Yes.
Was your case, your report peer reviewed?
Yes, every report from the forensic biology section is peer reviewed prior to release.
No further questions, Your Honor?
Ms. Phoebe?
You still have state 16 with you, sir?
I do.
Perfect. So that is the report that you submitted on this case, is that right?
Correct.
And in that, it is noted that when this sample was received in 2016, it was secured but lacked a proper seal. Is that right?
For which sample?
For the sexual assault kit.
It appears so, yes.
And so you do not know when that proper seal was removed, right?
So I didn't interact with that sample, so I don't know. I didn't really review that sort of information because the profiles from that were peer reviewed and released prior to my interaction. So I used that data without really interacting with that particular part of the report. Typically, what we have when you have that on there is we require per accreditation standards certain requirements that may not be required by other agencies. So we have to make sure that our accreditation standards are met before we'll accept it. That doesn't necessarily mean that it was not sealed or secured. It just wasn't to our accreditation standards. If it was torn or punctured or in any way compromised, our evidence receiving department wouldn't have taken it in without that being cured prior to the GBI receiving it.
Understood. So it wouldn't be you who would know who removed or whatever to the proper seal, right?
So typically, that sort of situation is the evidence tape wasn't initialed across the tape or something like that. In my experience, in the almost 13 years I've been there, that's the most common reason for us adding that, but I don't, off the top of my head, know what the actual issue was.
Understood. So without speculating, you cannot testify who removed that seal, right?
It's not necessarily that there was any seal removed. It may have been sealed that just wasn't up to snuff with our accreditation standards. It was probably sealed because we took the evidence in, so there wouldn't have been any integrity issues or we would not have accepted it.
If it was unsealed, it wouldn't have been accepted.
Mm.
It could be that the GBI requires 3 layers of tape and this had 2, and because it had 2, that would be deemed an improper seal at GBI stand. I'm making up the example, but is that would sort of fit what you're trying to describe?
Yeah, so if like it was in a paper bag that was just like a lunch bag that they'd put the kid in and they tried to hand it to us, we wouldn't accept it because we would make them come back, seal the actual bag and then hand it back to us.
But if the seal was with blue tape and your requirements are red tape, you'd still take it, but there would be this notation you're describing where it was improper seal. It wasn't red tape.
Yeah, so what happens is there's usually red tape on it. I don't know that I've seen anybody use anything but red tape, but what we have in evidence receiving is green tape. So when you have this on it, you have an additional piece of tape from our evidence receiving department that other people don't use. So we know that so we know what happened.
Okay.
So fair to say you don't know what about the seal was improper, right?
I do not know. Our evidence receiving department would know.
And then your evidence receiving department in this particular case sealed and initialed that sample, is that right?
Yeah, they added an extra layer of tape before sending it up to the section to be tested.
Okay. Once it got to your facility?
Correct.
Thank you. That's all I have.
All right. Ms. Reimer, anything else?
No, Your Honor.
Jurors? It's not obligatory. It's okay if you don't have questions. Mr. Schmidt, can you explain to the jury what a full match is? Does that mean all 24 match or what?
Yeah, so that would be, so if we're going to issue a match on this type of report, all of them would have to match. That doesn't necessarily mean all 24 match because, like I said, if you had a partial, you would have a more complete profile versus an incomplete profile, but all of the ones you do have would have to match. In this case, it appears that it was all 24 because we didn't state that it was partial.
Do you know if an oral swab from the sexual assault kit was analyzed for the presence of DNA in this case?
So all that's listed on the report that I used was the swabbing from the vaginal cervical swabs. The buccal swab from this victim is technically an oral swab, but we do label them separately for an evidence oral versus something that's intended to be used as a known sample. So I don't know if there was an oral swab in the kit or tested other than the known sample.
Can't really read the other question, but it has to do with the paper trail for the item that did not have, was improperly sealed. Would there be any paperwork anywhere in the person where it would be documented? It was improper because it was green tape and we need to put our green tape on there. So it shouldn't have had green tape.
So when they take in the evidence, they take images of it as is. And then if something needs to be rectified, they'll take another image after it's rectified. So if I had the images of the before and after, or the kit itself, I could probably tell you what was wrong. But I didn't review those images before coming to court today.
I didn't mean to speak over you. What is the title of someone who would have been taking the images of the rectification that was done?
So when something comes into our evidence receiving department, it's delivered either by certified mail, by physically handing it to one of the techs, or putting it in a lockbox. So once those lockboxes are closed, they can't be unlocked unless they're released from the back from one of our evidence receiving techs. They then open all of those lockboxes periodically through the day, take the evidence out, image it, make sure it has proper seals, it's not damaged in any way, and all of that stuff that we've mentioned before. And then they take the images as necessary, rectify anything as necessary, and then document all of that in our case file. So it's all in the actual business records of the GBI.
Okay. Any follow-up, Ms. Reimer?
Yes, we're looking at the sexual assault kit, help you determine if you can tell what it is.
Sure, I can take a look at it and see what I can find.
While she's bringing that to you, you've described a process that occurs where there would be a photo of the improperly sealed package and rectified and another photo. Did that protocol exist back whenever this was submitted? We're dealing with some old stuff.
Yes, yeah, no, it's been around for, I don't know. Again, we have our policies and they have a history on them that I could go through, but it's at the GBI.
Okay.
I don't actually know why this would be listed as, unless it was resubmitted for some reason.
I can't see how this doesn't offer speculation. This was something that happened in 2016.
So it wouldn't, if it was obvious. If it's not obvious, then he'll be speculating. So it was appropriate to ask the question, but there's nothing jumping out to Mr. Schmidt. And so if he's having to guess, then we'll need to get someone else to do that if that's where the state wants to go. But thank you for taking a look.
I have no recall.
Ms. Field, anything else? All right, Mr. Schmidt, appreciate your time. If you brought anything, you should take it with you. If you didn't bring anything, you're good to go.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are done with our first day of trial. I appreciate your attention and focus throughout the day. Our goal is to start as close to 9 a.m. tomorrow as we can. So do what you did today, except for one of you, in which case go through the back hallway, and be here. If you're running late, call that number that was on the whiteboard so we can stand down and know you're doing your best to get here, but it's Atlanta or something that got in your way. Tonight, you should do anything you want except outside research or talk to people about what's been going on today. Someone who means well is going to say, oh my gosh, my friend had X happen to her. And that's fascinating when we're done with the trial, but it's inappropriate today for that person to relay it to you because that's not this case. And we can't bring that person in as a witness. So enjoy yourselves this evening as best you can. We'll see you at 9 in the morning. Any logistical questions? Your notepads go back in the room, but stay in the jury room. Supposedly they fixed the toilet in the last half hour, so you should be back to 2 toilets tomorrow, but we'll check on that before you get here. And that's it. Thank you. Do you have a question, logistical question?
Oh, yeah, sorry, you said to leave the notepads in the room.
In the jury room, yep, on the table, just, you may want to put your name on it, or if you've got a special corner of the room, leave it in your special corner. You can throw them all in a big pile, it'll just be tricky in the morning sorting it out. All right, Deputy Gordon, if you wouldn't mind before you leave, getting more note cards. We have a prolific group and we're running low. Ms. Reimer, you'll have witnesses ready in the morning?
Yes, Your Honor.
Tomorrow, I'm not aware of any breaks other than the ones we need to take, so we'll start as close to 9 as we can. We'll take a mid-morning break, and then we'll break noonish for lunch, just sort of the ebb and flow of the witnesses. Any scheduling issues you're aware of, or should you be able to fill the day with witnesses tomorrow?
At this moment in time, I do not believe we are aware of any scheduling issues.
Okay, well, if something comes up, let everyone know. I ask us sometimes it's, we're gonna need to end a little early because our final witness can't be here till Wednesday, and that's fine. Just the more advanced notice we can get, the better.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, anything else from the state?
No, Your Honor.
Ms. Wood, anything from the defense?
No, Judge, thank you.
All right, then I will see everyone a little before 9 tomorrow morning, and we'll pick up where we left off.
How do you want to handle tomorrow's afternoon break, Your Honor?
Are all of the witnesses tomorrow pretty much yours? I heard what you said about you're the lead and all that, but I also know that if we have a chain of custody witness and you're not here for that, the world is going to continue to rotate.
Yes, Your Honor.
And so that's a perfect time for your break. But if tomorrow afternoon is Ms. Jones, then just we'll have a longer break. You seem pretty comfortable that we are